Communicative approaches. This lecture I intend to disambiguate and consolidate and help us work towards a big picture action plan. This is in response to the slew of readings and terminology that we've had thus far in the semester, and also to respond to our ongoing concerns for application. You'll recall from our early reading, it's I think chapter 1 of the Sels Mercia book, there was a description of the communicative language teaching movement. And there was a set of criteria that characterized the communicative language teaching, which involved learners wishing to convey and interpret meanings in actual contexts, and I'll say here, I'll just add social, academic, and professional, giving learners tools to communicate, and providing some choice regarding what learners might want to say or write, and allowing learners freedom to experiment, that is to say, to hypothesis test. Right? And so, content-based language teaching and critical pedagogy and community language learning and English for specific purposes and task-based language teaching and sheltered instruction, these are all expressions of the communicative approach. So here's a metaphor. Right? We basically drop learners into a pool filled with a particular set of meanings, and we give them swim lessons and various aids to help them swim. In this case, it's materials or specific parameters given through instructions or graphic organizers or other scaffolds or interactional criteria or specific texts to read. And then we give them a goal towards which they should swim. That is to say, we give them communicative goals. We give them reasons for self-expression, but we allow the learners their own individual freedom on how they're actually going to swim or express themselves within the conventions of the pool. So what are these pools of meaning as far as methods are concerned, and who determines them? What are the communicative goals? Well, in community language learning, the pool of meaning are the various social and affective needs that may be deemed useful or important to the learner or by the community around them. And the meanings that are expressed or explored are co-elected by instructors and the learners. And the goals are to feel a part of the community and to commune with other people in mutual interest in the expression of socially meaningful ideas. Critical pedagogy is very similar, except maybe it deals a bit more with problems. So the pool of meaning entails social and situational challenges experienced by the learner and the other learners in the class. And so the learners and the teacher look at the world or the community around them and problematize their own living situations. And as such, the goals are to more deeply understand the factors underlying their existential conditions. It's not just about complaining, it's about developing principled ways of thinking about situations and problem solving and collaborating in personally meaningful ways to do so. Then there's English for specific purposes, and that will include academic purposes, vocational purposes, and bilingual education, which can be done in academic and vocational settings, sheltered instruction, and even theme-based language instruction for that matter. And so the pools of meaning for these are whatever the concepts, whatever the valued thought processes, whatever the interactional abilities are deemed important by each specific content area, each specific purpose, whether it be academic, whether it be vocational. And the goals are to develop both a content area competence, that is to say the mastery of knowledge and thought processes, and to varying extent the linguistic competence, entailing the mastery of interactional and discursive linguistic styles of communication for each of these fields. Within these models, there's a range from content focus, which presupposes really a meaning focus, to linguistic focus, which can entail both a meaning focus and a form focus. Okay. So if you think about a history classroom, it's the main reason it exists is about the content, right? And sheltered instruction basically adds a little bit of linguistic focus to the mix. I'll talk about task-implicated methods. And these include TBLT, task-based language teaching, and task-supported language teaching. The pool of meaning is whatever is germane to the task. So whatever the task is about, the topic, the people who are involved, that's what circumscribes the set of meanings that get communicated. And the goals are to develop a linguistic competence, but in the context of and in conjunction with the development of some kind of specific social or procedural or technical kind of operation or task. Let's consider task-based language teaching. And I think a helpful way of thinking about it is from a lesson level approach first. So that is to say, you're just looking at each individual lesson, maybe just one lesson, and you may decide within that lesson or even within part of that lesson that there's going to be entirely a focus on meaning, and you're going to do that through some communicative tasks. Right? And you can do that within a mix of focus tasks, that is to say tasks where there is a specific form that's necessary but learners are not given notice of it, and unfocused tasks, that is to say that can be resolved through general communication. And I'll leave you to the literature to find out more about the implications of all of that. Now, of course, in institutional settings, lessons don't just exist by themselves. They actually exist in the context of some larger curriculum. And so this is where we can talk about a task-based syllabus, in which task-based teaching, TBLT, is the primary approach across all of the individual lessons. And so designers think in terms of, well, what's the optimal sequence of tasks that we should use for language teaching? And there is indeed research and literature on that as well. If you're interested, you can look up Peter Robinson and Skehan, are both researchers, as well as Rod Ellis, who work in this domain. Task-supported language teaching has that meaning orientation, but it also allows for focus on form activities. And so let's link task-implicated teaching to communicative language teaching. So that is to say both the task-supported and the task-based language teaching, and how does it relate to communicative language teaching in general. And the fact is that both task-implicated methods are compatible to varying degrees with each of the CLT variants. So where there is more of a concern with focus on meaning, then TBLT can be added to the overall method. So that goes for critical pedagogy, that goes for community language learning, that goes for English for specific purposes. Sheltered instruction is primarily a meaning-focused endeavor anyway, and so task-based language teaching can be added to that. Where there is some concern for focus on form, however, in addition to a focus on meaning, then task-supported language teaching can be added to the overall method. So, for example, this is a case where I would look at sheltered instruction in American high schools, which often include in those classes, native speakers are in those classes. So the content teacher really isn't going to be going into the nitty-gritty of language teaching. They might have language objectives and direct learners to try to use them in communicative tasks. A little bit of preemptive going on, but there's not a lot of heavy working of the focus on form. You might see that in more the case, for example, of Lister's counterbalanced content-based language teaching, where it starts off with a focus on meaning, but then there's a specific phase in the approach where there is a dedicated language focus, and that might entail strictly focus on meaning-based tasks, but also focus on form activities. So depending upon how the teacher wants to teach that counterbalanced method, it may entail more or less focus on form. Now, all of these methods, really need to be discussed in the context of who they are being applied to and where. And I really don't have any prescriptions on this front because it comes down to how you choose to implement on the ground. But let me talk about the kinds of things that are involved in your decision making. Okay. So decisions about whether you're working with older learners versus younger learners, college age versus K-12. Okay, you can use all of these methods. You have to modify them, but you can certainly use them with both young and old. But maybe you may feel that some variants of that, some applications might be more appropriate with one population versus the other. When you're working with multilingual versus monolingual populations, like in foreign language contexts, for example, in somewhere in the Middle East, you're teaching English to engineers. They're all monolingual. That is to say, they all share the same first language, versus multilingual populations where people don't share the same first language and they're all in the same classroom. So that might be in a second language environment. So, but also, whether you are working with even native speakers of the same language in America, you may choose to do, some kind of scaffolding. It depends on whether non-natives are mixed in with the class or not. All right. In American schools, it's a big deal the extent to which we are taking into consideration the special education needs. So we have things called IEPs, or individual education plans, and then there's 504. So it's basically learners with different types of disabilities, and they need different types of supports. Now, it just so happens that a lot of the techniques that are used in sheltered instruction are also applicable to learners in what we call special education here in the United States. Foreign language versus second language contexts I talked about. Also in countries where we're dealing with dominant language varieties and non-dominant language varieties. So for example, in China, you have your regional dialects or regional languages, and you have the national standard. And in some cases, the regional variants are actually really quite different from the national standard, and they may have high or low prestige. So it's very often this issue of national prestige is involved, and that has some kind of influence on how you put those methods that we talked about to use. Okay, because it involves who are the people who are talking, what are the social relationships that are involved. Okay, the country's language policy. So it's kind of tied to dominant and non-dominant varieties, but if there are politics and actual policy involved, that is going to skew you towards certain methods versus others. And I have heard from many students coming from China that the way policy is set up, and especially, for example, the testing requirements that are at the end of a school career, all of these things really predispose to a certain type of teaching, and nobody says that such teaching is necessarily good for communicative competence. Nonetheless, you have to deal with those tensions. And then, of course, other tensions include cultural expectations of teaching and learning by the students themselves. I, having worked with adult learners, they come from different countries, different educational backgrounds, and they may feel that communicative language teaching is froofy. They prefer something more form-focused. And so you have to deal with that in some way. What's the role of the teacher? So here I want to talk actually about practical implications. This is where we take all of these ideas ahead of that we just talked about, and we start putting them to use for us. All right. So let's just assume that communicative competence is the desired outcome. So what's a teacher going to do? You can leave this class today, and you're going to go out and you're going to get yourself a job. What's the first thing you do when you get in? Well, first thing you should do is a situational analysis. That is to say, while while the school headmaster might hand you a textbook and a curriculum, what I would do is I would open up my eyes and my ears and not just rely on something that's handed to me. I would need to see what language learners need to thrive in that context, because sometimes the curriculum is actually at odds with what learners need to be doing. It shouldn't be, but it sometimes is. So you need to observe the language learning environment, that is to say the environment where these people are using that language. Look at the physical location, look at the materials, the content goals. And when we take this into schools, we find out that the kinds of things that we're asking learners to do in history class might be different than the kinds of things we're asking them to do in science class. The ways of talking about stuff are different. And so we need the latitude to address that. All right. So you pay attention to that, because that's where you start saying, this is the source of need. That is to say, this is the beginnings of the pool of meaningfulness right here. Additionally, look at the terminology. That also constitutes the pool of meaningfulness. Look at the expected interactions and the discourse patterns. Is there writing of essays? Is there writing of lab reports? Is there debate? Is there lots of group work and sharing and peer critique? Okay, I look at all of those things, and then I start basing a syllabus on the needs of my data collection. So with that data collection, I could develop a curriculum. That is to say, a scope. That is to say, the sum of the ideas, the total of the ideas, the body of ideas, and also the sequence. That is to say, the order in which I'm going to be exploring these ideas or these skills, the various competences. And I also take into consideration the situational demands, right, and the proficiency of the learner. Okay, so it's all very well and good if science class is asking you to be whiz bang with certain procedures and also your ability to express yourself. But if that's the expectation, but you're what we call a port of entry learner, that is to say somebody who just arrived gets dropped into that science class. Well, it doesn't matter. What so much what's going on in the class at a high level. You need to find a way to connect that low level learner to what's going on in the class, and you do that through differentiated language objectives. Okay, so you write language objectives maybe for a couple of different proficiencies of learners, as we do in K-12 in the United States. In science class, history class, learners are obliged to be there, whether they have the linguistic ability or not. And so we write differentiated language objectives for each level of learner in the same content class. And then we are responsible and we create communicative learning situations that are consistent with the goals of the curriculum, but also that are consistent with the proficiency of the learner. Right? And we try to keep things oriented towards communication as best we can. There certainly can be focus on form, but we don't get too far away from the communication issue. And then I go around and I start selecting materials and I identify tasks that make that authentic language use happen, right? And I sequence these materials and these tasks judiciously. And then, that's kind of my roadmap. I've set up a learning plan for a semester. Then I take it down to a class-by-class level or a task-by-task level within a class, okay, with an eye to language development. And there are 5 basic stances that I can take: implicit reactive, implicit preemptive, explicit reactive, and explicit preemptive, and of course mixed, which entails all of these. So let me talk about each one very briefly. Implicit reactive. This is where you prioritize implicit learning mechanisms, and in this case, the teacher is really a facilitator of conversation and focus on meaning. So if you think about your critical pedagogy scenario where the teacher's really just getting people to talk about problems and explore solutions. The teacher's there really just to keep the conversation going, to negotiate meaning reactively. So that is to say that when a comprehension problem arises or when a communication problem arises, the teacher might ask for a clarification request. I'm sorry, what do you mean? Can you repeat that? Maybe pushing the learner towards reformulation. Or if it's a discussion between two learners, the teacher can jump in and say, why don't you just repeat what you just said? I don't think Javier understood what you were trying to say, right? So you don't necessarily have to wait for the learners to take control, although it's better when they do, when they take control of their own situations, of their own conversation, right? But what you're doing is you're avoiding specifically referencing the linguistic code. That is to say, you're avoiding being form focused. Implicit preemptive. So basically, it's the same focus on meaning, but you stage situations. You stack the deck where specific language forms are likely to be necessary or used. So of course, when you choose a topic, then of course that predisposes learners to a certain set of vocabulary. If you ask learners to tell you what happened yesterday as opposed to tell you what their expectations are from the future, you are predisposing them to using past tense versus future tense. All right, but what you do is you try not to, or you avoid signaling to the learners in advance what those forms are. So you don't pre-teach the past tense and then say, okay, guys, we are going to tell a story of what happened to us in the past. That's not implicit preemptive. All right, that is actually entailing explicit and preemptive, which we'll get to. So explicit reactive is to say that there is a primary focus on meaning, and then there is a breakdown in communication, and then there's a momentary focus on form where maybe a teacher explains a rule or some kind of form-meaning-use relationship as needed in response to a communication problem, and then back to communication as usual. The teacher might run up to the board and write the grammar rule or the exemplar on the board, right? And then explicit preemptive, again, this basically gets at this idea of stacking the deck. So there are language forms that are intended to be used. That is to say, the teacher wants to steer learners toward the target forms. And so what the teacher might do is actually pre-teach. And this is where we get to the PPP method, present, practice, and production, sometimes called the gradual release. And this connects to what we call it prioritizes or it recognizes a flow from explicit learning mechanisms to implicit learning mechanisms. So that there's some assumption of an interface position, and that's consistent with the skill acquisition theory, as explained by De Keyser. Right? And then there is the mixed bag, right? And in this case, the teacher is basically doing a whole lot of everything, but deciding from moment to moment based on how they feel, where there are teachable and learnable moments, how to best utilize the next 45 minutes and make an efficient use of time. But at the same time, valuing the learner's need to communicate, to experiment, and to get feedback, right? So the teacher decides how preemptive or reactive and how meaning-focused and how form-focused they're going to be. But we don't depart too far from meaning focus. And so let me list out a bunch of things that I do or think about. I find out ways of, so in addition to me anticipating or assuming what learners know or do not know, I also allow learners to indicate to me what they do not know. So in the case of a reading passage, I ask learners to scan the reading passage and underline vocabulary before they actually start reading, to underline the vocabulary that does not strike them as immediately familiar. And that gives me an opportunity to pre-teach, right? Based on maybe some kind of prior performance. I use that as an indication of what learners know and don't know, and then I set up a learning situation that addresses that, right? I find all kinds of ways of making unknown form, meaning, use relationships salient to the learner. I could do it with pictures. I can do it with explanations on the board. I can use, I could stand on my head if I needed to, okay? I could act things out. I can model them, right? All kinds of ways of making what's unknown known to them in some way. I decide on the extent to which feedback is immediate or delayed. And I certainly have my own criteria for that, right? I don't correct learners, especially in the meaning-focused phases. I'm very careful not to interrupt the flow, right? Maybe I'll be taking notes where I perceive language problems to be during authentic communication, and then we'll take a momentary break 5 minutes down the line and say, hey, let's recap. I noticed that while you guys were communicating, you had difficulty expressing something. Let me help you out here. I set up parameters where learners are taking notes, or I'm asking them to not take notes. Okay, so I am, I set up these criteria because if they're taking notes, maybe they're not so engaged in communication, right? Right? Any of the post-method macro strategies that we learned about, those are all relevant. Any of the Ellis's 11 principles, those are all relevant in my mixed bag, okay? And I choose which one I want to act on at any given time. Just to reiterate, what's important is that I start with a primarily focused on meaning experience for the learner. So consistent with Roy Lister's content-based language teaching. He says there is a focus on the content, on the meaning phase, and then there is a specific phase for language issues, and then return back to the content and meaning-focused phase, okay? So we start with a focus on meaning, that we figure out that there's something we want to communicate that's meaningful to us. And then we work in either the presence of or the absence of some kind of reactive focused on form. Okay? And in addition to reactive focus on form, I can have the presence of or the absence of preemptive focus on form. What this really entails is a lot of monitoring of the situation and developing a sense through experience of when's a good time to jump in, when's a good time to collect the learners and talk about something in the linguistic form, and when's a good time just to facilitate the flow of conversation and keep learners engaged in meaningful talk. Okay? Because both scenarios have value, and together they have even more value. And research really does support both the combination, not just the exclusive use of either focus on meaning or focus on form, but the combination of both, predominantly focus on meaning. Again, back to Ellis's principles. All right, so I've done a whole bunch of teaching throughout the semester, and I've applied all my little tricks, and I've really skipped around the methods. All right, how do I finish up? Well, I make sure I'm conducting formative and summative assessments. Formative assessments along the way. How well are my learners doing? What language is emerging? What language is developing? What language is perfected on any given day? And that will influence what I do the next day. And then, of course, summative assessments at the end of the semester. And As always, I try to renew the cycle of learning. So based on what I've discovered in these, I try to have that feedback into a new cycle of learning. Anyway, I hope you found that helpful. I realize I've covered a whole lot of ideas, but I wanted to provide just a basic roadmap that helps you start thinking about putting these ideas to work for you and also understanding how a lot of these ideas relate to one another.